A Pearl of Great Price. Preface. There is no doubt that the pearl of sobriety has a great price, whether one uses the word price in the sense of cost or of value. Usually, alcoholics have paid an immense price by the time the pearl is bought, and they go on their way rejoicing. No one can estimate the value of the pearl of sobriety except alcoholics and their loved ones. Cost or value, the pearl of sobriety has a great price. A program about living, not about drinking. Sometimes the greatest truths are the simplest ones and the hardest to see. After sitting through an exceptionally good AA meeting one night, the thought came to me that the speakers were all talking about living and not about drinking or not drinking. As I sat there, I let my mind drift back through the years to the best AA meetings I could remember. What had impressed me most? What I remembered as best were not the drunkalogues nor the tales of sleepless nights and marital fights, but the simple, low-key statements about living. People talk about how nice it is to be home on Christmas Eve and how sick they were on Christmas morning. They are stories about being restored to the church of one's childhood, about broken plumbing and cars that would not start, stories about living. I let my eyes stray to the omnipresent 12 steps, one mention of alcohol and one of alcoholics. Taken as a whole, it is a program for living. There is nothing at all about how to drink or how not to drink. In a moment of revelation, I saw the program of Alcoholics Anonymous as a way to live. Not a way for alcoholics to live, nor for the spouse of the alcoholic to live, but a way for people to live, beautifully, serenely, and securely. For a moment I glimpsed at what life could be like. Out of it. There are only 3 outs for alcoholics: out of their minds, insanity; out of this world, death; and out of drinking, recovery. I have heard this repeatedly at AA meetings, and it is true. Alcoholism is an incurable, progressive, and fatal disease. Anyone who would deny this statement doesn't know about alcoholism. It is with a great deal of sadness that I look back and remember the alcoholics who took the route out of this world. They died from accidents and suicide and organic damage. They died from pneumonia and heart attacks and sudden, dreadful hemorrhages. They died in confusion, bewilderment, and a sense of wasted lives. It is with even greater sorrow that I watch alcoholics drinking themselves out of their minds. One can see them at the mental hospitals, brain damaged and confused, with Jake leg and wrist droop, disoriented and finally incompetent and incontinent. It is with a sense of joy that I watch alcoholics follow the other route, out of drinking. Often I have sat through a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and wondered where those present would be if it were not for AA. Some die, surely, some in jail, some in mental hospitals, and some still in the gin mills trying to find the solution in a bottle. The problem is simple. Which one of the outs will alcoholics choose? The solution is equally simple. Let us get on with it. Look for it where you lost it. Very often we are faced with the spectacle of alcoholics who seem to be willing to do whatever is necessary to find sobriety, only to discover that they don't want to do it at home. They seek confidants from out of town with whom to discuss their problems and go to another city to be hospitalized. They then find many reasons why they can't go back to AA in their hometown. Very often these alcoholics are persons of some standing in the community, or they may be alcoholics who have had a lengthy period of sobriety and who have returned to drinking. They have convinced themselves that no one knows about their drinking problems, and so they will recover on the sly, slipping back into their daily life, with no one being the wiser. It is obvious that they don't realize that everyone around them knows they have a problem, and that if they show up on the street, sober and happy, it will be rather apparent what has transpired. There is another deeper reason for searching for sobriety among one's friends. One of the pioneer members of AA, who has since gone to his reward, used to put it beautifully. If you lost a valuable diamond ring, where would you look for it? In another town? In another state? Of course not. You would look for it where you lost it. The answer is obvious. The book Alcoholics Anonymous speaks of rigorous honesty and means just that. Rigorous honesty includes searching for sobriety where you lost it. At home. What do you do when the music stops? I suppose that the phrase musical chairs has pretty much disappeared from our language, just as the game has disappeared. An earlier, less sophisticated generation used to have lots of fun with this game. Several chairs were placed in a circle, with the seats facing outward. The number of chairs was always one less than the number of players who circled the chairs while someone beat out a tune on the piano. The piano player sat with his or her back to the players and stopped playing at random times. When the music stopped, everyone tried to find a chair, and the one without a chair was out of the game. Then another chair was removed, and the players began circling again. Always when the music stopped, there was one player without a chair. When the game got down to 2 players and 1 chair, the results were exciting, to say the least. I'm often reminded of this game when I see the alcoholic gradually getting sicker. During each drinking bout, the music plays and the excitement builds, and early in the game, the odds are usually pretty good that there will be a place for the alcoholic when the music stops. The job is still there. The loved ones are still at home, and the friends are willing to forget the knocked-over lamp and the dirty stories told in their living room. Every time the music stops, there are fewer and fewer places of refuge, and the alcoholic must search more desperately for a place to heal up. If we could take the chairs away at a faster rate, it may not take so long before the alcoholic discovers that standing alone in the middle of the room with no place to hide is no longer fun and games. When playing musical chairs, the one left alone is the winner, and it may also be true in the alcoholism game. It's worth a try. Our lives had become unmanageable. The idea for this essay came from my friend Norm, whom I heard present it to a first-step class in an alcoholism treatment center. The wisdom is profound. Like so many steps in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step always seems to reward additional study. There are really 2 thoughts in the step, and while they are related, they are not inseparable. The first part is what we usually see, and we often stop there. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Well, this is a fascinating statement. Now, it doesn't say we gradually became less and less able to control our drinking, nor does it say we crossed the line from social drinking to alcoholism, but starkly and calmly states the fact that an alcoholic is powerless. I have often thought how great it would be if non-alcoholics or even our society would recognize how powerful we are over alcohol. Let's go on. The second part of the step, that our lives had become unmanageable, seems to be as interesting for what it does not say as for what it does say. It does not say our lives had become unmanageable because of alcohol. It does not say drinking had made our lives unmanageable. It simply says our lives had become unmanageable. See how simple this makes the whole thing? We don't have to get anyone to admit that they are alcoholics. We don't have to convince them that they are drinking too much. We don't have to convince them that there is a connection between alcohol and the unmanageability of their lives. That comes later. Once more, we can see how the suggested steps of AA are so valuable to the non-alcoholic. All of us in this business can readily admit that we are powerless over alcohol, and that our lives very often become unmanageable. This knowledge not only prepares us to deal effectively with the still suffering alcoholic, but it helps our lives too. A simple program for complex people. Once, after I had spoken to a group of AA members, a guy stopped me to talk. I heard you tonight, and I hear from the old deacons all the time that this is a simple program. I should throw all the books and lectures and just follow the program. I don't believe that's right. I think this is a very complex program. Well, of course, I hadn't told him to throw out all literature because I think AA literature is very important, a very important part of the program. But I still had to plead guilty to call AA a simple program. For a moment, I was at a loss. My answer went something like this. Well, one might say that checkers is a simple game. It is, compared to chess. Two children can sit down and play checkers after 5 minutes of instruction. But did you ever play checkers with an expert? I have, and I can't for the life of me figure out what was going on. It seems to be such a simple game, but I just couldn't win. Maybe the game is simple, but the way the expert plays, it isn't. I went on to do some thinking. When I'm sitting on a lake or river sometimes waiting for the fish to bite, I like to watch the little insects that live on the surface of the water. They skate about, supported by the surface tension, and seem to have no inkling that beneath them is 10 feet of water. The surface serves them very well, thank you, and they have no need to go deeper. I guess one more dimension of the miracle of AA is that one can use it at whatever level necessary to meet one's needs. Some people find that using AA at an amazingly simple level is adequate to their needs. Some find that they need forever to be plunging beneath the surface to find out how deep the water really is. The beautiful part is that it works at whatever level the alcoholic needs to have it work. Each alcoholic is different, and the program is different for each alcoholic. Dry for 15 years, happy for 3 months. The speaker was a man whom I considered the #1 counselor in a large alcoholism hospital. I knew many people who had found sobriety through his assistance. When he spoke, we all listened, for he was a successful and, until now, we thought a happy recovering alcoholism counselor. I was a guest at the AA meeting, and I listened, spellbound. I will try to paraphrase his story because I can't remember it exactly. He said that during the years since he had stopped drinking, he had watched a great number of people attain sobriety, and with it, happiness. They showed up at AA meetings with stars in their eyes, and he was glad for them. The only problem was that he didn't feel the same way. He simply could not solve the mystery of why sobriety brought them so much joy, and him so little. Finally, the scales fell from his eyes, and he realized that he hadn't taken a complete 5th step. Sure, he had shared a great amount of rotten stuff with his sponsor, but there were a lot of goodies that he had kept back. Each one, like a splinter in flesh, festered and irritated him until he knew no peace. Fortunately, his sponsor was still available, so he went back again to complete his 5th step. 5 times he went back, and finally the slate was clean. Now at last, he could stand at an AA meeting, throw out his arms, and announce joyously, "I am happy." Acceptance or resignation. We are apt to hear the word acceptance bruised about considerably in the alcohol business, but it was not until I attended a memorial service for one to whom I was very close that the light began to dawn as to exactly what this word means. The minister hadn't known my friend, but he had become aware that my friend had suffered a series of overwhelming disasters in his life, many of which were simply unavoidable. In his homily, the minister discussed the difference between acceptance and resignation in a remarkably perceptive way. Although he didn't have the alcoholic in mind, he couldn't have come closer to the truth for someone seeking release from this baffling illness. We talk a lot about getting the alcoholic to surrender, and the serenity prayer asks for the ability to accept things one cannot change. It seems to me that right here is a point which must be resolved if the alcoholic is to indeed recover. Resignation, to me, means to recognize that an unalterable situation exists and to withdraw from the battle. If one cannot change the situation, then one is not required to do anything. To me, to resign means to quit. To accept, on the other hand, means to recognize that the unalterable situation exists and to begin the search for ways of dealing with it. To accept doesn't mean to withdraw from the battle, but to recognize that the conflict must be shifted to another arena. Thus it is with alcoholics. Once they realize they are alcoholics and their lives are uncontrollable, they must not withdraw from the fray. They must simply realize that while their head-on battles with alcohol are invariably lost, they can find a way to live so they don't have to fight those battles. Just as my friend sought new ways to live a life that had become almost unlivable, so must alcoholics. Once more, we are brought to the realization that alcoholics aren't much different than the rest of us. They just seem different. No seniority. Many of us have had the experience of attending AA meetings and hearing speakers say something like this: "My name is Bud, and I've been sober for the last 24 hours. Or perhaps someone else will say, "Having had the privilege of several 24 hours of sobriety," or some such thing. We find out later that they have had 20 or 30 years of sobriety. At first I thought this was sort of reverse snobbery. I felt that the speakers were saying that they had such an extensive sobriety that everyone knew it and they didn't have to talk about it. Sort of like the millionaire who drives a 5-year-old family sedan. As usual, all I had to do was listen to find out what was going on. It wasn't until I heard an alcoholic say, "There's no seniority in this business," that the meaning really penetrated my understanding. The same thought is present when the alcoholic says, "I am only one drink away from a drunk." It's really the same thing. No matter how long alcoholics have been sober, the accumulated days and weeks of sobriety do not protect them from the consequences if they return to drinking. Alcohol gives them no credit for the time they have gone without drinking. It extracts the same price from the short timer that it does from the long timer. Frequently, alcoholics must test this wisdom. I once heard a person I knew who was coming off a drunk say, "Well, I figured that if I could go 2 years without a drink, I could surely take 2 drinks and quit." You've got to remember to carry the message, not the alcoholic. Over and over, this was drilled into me by a very close friend who died sober after a life of turmoil and who led more people to sobriety than most of us will ever be able to do. Usually, he laid this on me when I was telling him how I leaped from my bed to drive through a blizzard to take an alcoholic to the hospital for the umpteenth time. How difficult it is to carry the message and yet not carry the alcoholic. We are carrying persons, or we would not be in the business of helping alcoholics for very long. We know that we will have very little effect on the lives of alcoholics if they don't believe we really care. We have been raised in a culture and tradition that tells us if we really care for people, we will pay their rent, buy their groceries, and give them a little pocket money to improve their self-esteem. Now we are faced with the facts that if we do this or anything like it for the alcoholic, we are playing the role of enabler, and all we do is allow the alcoholic to continue drinking. Add this to the fact that if we withhold our help, some innocent person, such as a spouse or child, are going to get hurt, and you begin to see how difficult it is to stop short once we have carried the message. We are all sorry that the art and science of helping the alcoholic is in such a primitive stage, and the process is so painful and costly for everyone involved. But the cost and pain are far less than if we let the illness run its course, so we must use the knowledge available to us. An important part of that knowledge is that we must carry the message, not the alcoholic. You'll fall off your cloud. It was after an AA meeting, and the young man was very troubled. He was in AA and getting the message. He was feeling good. Things were working for him just like everybody said they would. Then what was his problem? "I keep running into these old AA guys," he said, "and they all tell me not to get too happy. Sooner or later I'll fall off this cloud and I'll go back to feeling like I used to feel. I don't want to feel that way. I want to feel like this. Must I go back to that old gloom and doom? Well, not being a fortune teller, I would not tell him how he would feel in the future. Nobody could. I was able to say, however, that I did not think he would find it necessary to go back to feeling as badly as he used to. Perhaps the pink cloud would fade away, but it was highly possible to establish himself on a higher plane of happiness than he had been experiencing in the past. Of course, he would exchange the problems of drinking for the problems of living. But then he had them in the past, both of them. Now, instead of running away from living, he was dealing with it. By dealing with it, he had access to pride and assurance that go with any job well done. Is it inevitable that one falls off one's cloud? I truly hope not. The survivors. It was a good morning. There were 4 speakers, all of whom were a little grizzled, a little long in the tooth. They spoke of how things used to be and how they are now. It's nothing earth-shaking unless one feels that telling how a life was changed and saved is earth-shaking. The meeting group seemed to be divided into 2 classes, the old-timers and the young people, 5 of whom identified themselves as attending their first meeting. The young people were having trouble identifying with the old-timers, and 1 or 2 of the speakers seemed to sense it. What I hoped for and didn't get was for the speakers to identify themselves as survivors. Everyone who speaks at an AA meeting has sobriety, at least for the moment, and we tend to forget those who came, looked in the door, and left to continue their way to insanity and death. What I wanted the old-timers to talk about were the guys they started drinking with. What happened to them? Where are they now? Why didn't they find sobriety? Maybe it was too painful to talk about. Maybe they have forgotten about their early drinking companions. Maybe they don't think it was important, but we all knew that there were some people in the room who were not getting the message and who might not come back ever. Sometimes I hope to hear old-timers talk about being survivors, why they survived, and why they think some others didn't survive. The God bit. The scene was an AA meeting, and the setting was an absolutely beautiful old mansion that had been converted into a meeting place. The leader spoke briefly of how much his belief in a higher power had come to mean to him, and then each person around the room spoke on the same subject. We came to a tough-looking older man whose clothes were sharper than most of ours. "I went down the God road a number of times," he said, "and always with the same result. Try as I might, I couldn't understand God, and each time I got to feeling so badly about it that I got drunk. This last time," he continued, "I decided not to worry about a higher power or God or whatever you call it, but just to rely on the warm, caring fellowship of AA to keep me sober. It has kept me sober for a year and a half now. I don't feel like drinking, and as long as I have this loving support from other alcoholics, I don't need God." There wasn't any old-time, hardcore, recovering alcoholics in the meeting, so he got away with it. Since I was an outsider, I kept quiet too. What he had done was describe God in one of the best ways I have ever heard it done. There was sort of a wry humor in the fact that he was staying sober through one of the finest manifestations of God, while denying that God exists. I don't suppose it is in anyone's obligation to point out to him the error of his ways because he was staying sober. God is something like gravity. Nobody really understands it, but we rely on it all the time. I guess if I were to talk to this man, and I won't, but if I did, I would say that God as we understand God can also mean God as we don't understand God. If I had to understand electricity before I turned on the light, well, I would spend a lot of time in darkness. Comes the dawn. I am always envious of persons who have a spiritual awakening which is so overwhelming that they can say at what moment it occurred and that from what time onward their lives were different. 2 such persons would be one who said, "It seemed as if the room was filled with light," and the others who said, "My heart was strangely warmed." The first, of course, was Bill W., the founder of AA, and the other John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. Many times in my life, I have had occasion to be in the woods to wait for the dawn. First, as I sat under a tree, I looked at the shadows against the sky. The only way I knew the shadows were trees is because they could be nothing else but formless, silent, and waiting. As I sat waiting, I would become aware that I could now see the shape of a tree, although I wasn't conscious that the day had gotten any lighter. My mind wandered, and as my attention returned to the tree, I was aware that I could now see the tree quite clearly and make out some of the larger branches. Time passed, and the smaller trees became visible. Again, I waited, and finally I could see each tree perfectly. All the twigs and leaves and even the blemishes on the bark were visible in perfect detail. I could finally see it all. I think this is the way spiritual insight comes to most of us, rather than as a bolt of lightning. First, however, if we could see the trees, we must go where they are. It is probably completely dark, and we are lucky if we can see an outline against the sky. We wait, and the dawn begins to come. Slowly, imperceptibly, we begin to see. It is not likely that we will ever see completely in perfect detail, but as we wait and believe, the clarity does come. It is not given to most of us to achieve insight in a flash, but we must wait. It is seldom completely dark. One thing for sure, we will never see the trees if we don't go into the woods. A pretty good measuring stick. Once alcoholics have achieved long sought-for sobriety, they are faced with a lot of questions concerning how will they live. All of my friends drink. What shall I serve them when they come to my house? When I go to a party and someone offers me a drink, what shall I do? Shall I take it and carry it around for a while and then set it down? Shall I ask for ginger ale, or shall I tell them I'm an alcoholic? I like to play cards and shoot pool. Shall I go into a gin mill to do these things? What about that fifth in the cupboard? Shall I keep it or pour it down the sink? Once the alcoholic gets some experience in sobriety, the answers are obvious. If all your friends drink, get some new friends. Put a pool table in your basement and invite your AA friends to play cards. Get rid of the fifth at once, as well as the pints, quarts, and half gallons, which you will discover from time to time hidden in some unlikely places. What should alcoholics do until maturity and sobriety answers these questions for them? Well, the answer is quite simple, and is often the case, lies in another question. How do you feel about it? Do you feel comfortable about that fifth in the cupboard, or does it pop into your mind while you are reading the evening paper? Take your own mental temperature. Anything you feel perfectly comfortable about doing without any rationalization is probably all right. Anything that gives you the slightest uneasiness, don't do it, change it, and get rid of it at once. It's surprising how well it works. I never knew an alcoholic who never drank. It seems passing strange to find one debating whether or not alcohol has anything to do with alcoholism, but the controversy rages on. It is easy to see why those who make, advertise, sell, and tax alcohol would like to feel that alcohol has nothing to do with alcoholism, because even the most insensitive among us do not want to feel in any way responsible for the tragedy of alcoholism. If they can intellectualize and rationalize enough, they can continue to make a bundle off the alcoholic and not have to live with guilt feelings about it. Never mind the protesting that they want to sell only to the non-problem drinkers. Recent evidence shows that about 10% of the drinkers buy about half of the alcohol, and we know who these people are, don't we? There's another group which falls into the same trap, and it's a group which one is surprised to find in such a position. These are alcoholism counselors. They are really capable counselors who understand the illness of alcoholism and how to deal with it. They realize that the alcoholic must do more than put the plug in the jug. I don't know much about the whys of alcoholism, but I do know something about the whats. One what I know? I never met an alcoholic who never drank alcohol. An alcoholic first. It was many years after I attended my first AA meeting that I met my first woman AA member. It was many more years before I met my first African American at an AA meeting, and even longer before I met my first Native American at such a meeting. In fact, there seemed to be a period in the beginning that if you were not white, Irish, and male, you had little chance of getting into AA. Other people observed this too, and it was not long until we began to get minority alcoholism programs for women, alcoholism programs for the disadvantaged, alcoholism programs for the rich, and programs for all sorts of special groups. This has been both productive and counterproductive, and I will try to separate the two. The key to the situation seems to be whether we believe that alcoholism is a disease. If it is, then we can't have black or white or female alcoholism any more than we have black or white or female appendicitis. Those who have the illness of alcoholism have special needs related to their orientation, but then every alcoholic has special needs. One of the worst mistakes we make in trying to help the alcoholic find sobriety is to try to force him or her into some standard mold, rather than letting them graze freely in the pasture of enlightenment. To mix a metaphor rather badly. Once again, Alcoholics Anonymous seems to have solved this problem very nicely. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. The program has room for everyone, no matter what special needs there are. An alcoholic is an alcoholic first and something else second. One night while I was sitting at an AA meeting waiting for one of the speakers to end his interminable drunkalogue, my eyes fell on the word honesty on a plaque on the wall, and I began to wonder about what we really mean by honesty. The Big Book of AA says that those who are unable to make the AA program are usually persons who are either unwilling or incapable of absolute honesty, particularly with themselves. As I sat there, I remembered a time when my father had apprehended me in the midst of some particularly sneaky bit of dishonesty, and he used a story to tell me how honest he wanted me to be. It might fit here, so I'll share it with you. It seems there was once a farmer who had been losing his chickens to some unknown cause. One night he heard a disturbance in the chicken house and went with his shotgun to investigate. He opened the door and discovered his neighbor in the chicken house with a sack half full of chickens. Now, this neighbor had a reputation for absolute honesty. He was so honest that the farmer, rather than marching him off to see the sheriff, asked him what was going on. "I'll tell you," the neighbor said. "I knew you had been losing chickens, and tonight, just at dark, I noticed that some of your chickens were roosting in my trees. I was afraid a wild animal would get them, so I gathered them up, put them in a sack, and brought them here. You were in bed, so rather than disturb you, I decided to put them back on the roost." "Now," my father said, "that neighbor was so honest that the farmer believed him. That's how honest I want you to be. My neighbor doesn't have a hen house, but if he did and he caught me there with some of his chickens in a sack, I rather think he would call the police." This is kind of a simple story, but maybe it does give us a glimpse of what real honesty is. If one can be that honest with oneself, it is not only likely that one can obtain sobriety, but can accomplish most any change that one wishes to make. Projection. I may get into deep water here, but the technique of projection is so common among alcoholics that it needs to be discussed. Projection in this context can be defined as attributing one's own attitudes and feelings to someone else. Among alcoholics, projection is common and obvious. My wife doesn't love me. My boss doesn't understand me. Most people would like to see me dead. It doesn't take a genius to understand that alcoholics are telling us exactly how they feel about themselves. But let's go on. What about we who help the alcoholic? Aren't we often guilty of projecting our own feelings onto the alcoholic? Watch yourself carefully the next time you deal with an alcoholic. See if you are not only viewing the alcoholic through the window of your own bias and experience, but are also attributing your own feelings to the alcoholic. There seems to be a lot of brush to clear away before we can see the alcoholic as he or she really is. There are many ways we can let our own needs get in the way of the needs of the alcoholic. One of the most subtle is to see alcoholics as we need to see them to serve our own needs, not as they really are. I have no panaceas, but prayer and meditation go a long way toward lifting the fog. Picking winners. I once knew an alcoholic who liked to say that he had sponsored 5 alcoholics in 5 years, and that they had all achieved sobriety. I assumed that he was proud of the fact that his skills of sponsorship were such that he would help anyone he wished to sobriety. A further discussion over the years revealed what really happened was that he looked over the new crop of pigeons at the AA meeting until he saw one that looked like a winner and then offered his sponsorship. I guess there is nothing wrong with this, but I often wonder what happens to the losers. Even though many alcoholics who come to recovery without a chance in the world for recovery do so anyway, there are some who seem to carry a card around their necks marked loser. They are really miserable people to be around. They all show anger at the treatment centers. They show up at AA meetings smelling like a bar rag. They manipulate everyone and everything around them. They don't recover. They hang around the fringes, demanding that we spend our time and money on them, and complain because getting sober is so difficult for them. They worry about what is going to happen to their jobs. They upset our neat little world in which we have established the rules for recovery, and they drain us dry. These people need our love most of all. Many of them will stay drunk and eventually die on us. They threaten our theories, our procedures, and our complacency. We must be prepared to give them a disproportionately large share of ourselves and keep on trying and trying when they fail. If they serve no other function, they show us once and for all that we are not God. Punctuation. Occasionally, we are privileged to hear some wisdom so profound that it doesn't require comment. In fact, comment would cheapen it. I will lay the background and let the wisdom speak for itself. A woman I know has now what seems to be a solid, rewarding sobriety, but it was not always so. Not only was her search for sobriety a difficult matter for herself, but it was tremendously complicated by problems in her immediate family. Finally, when she seemed to have her own sobriety in hand, someone close to her took her own life. In sheer desperation, she called her sponsor. Why did God let this happen? Mary, not her real name, don't put a question mark where God has put a period. Spiritual insight or despair. I have put off writing about this matter for a long time. It wasn't until I reread most of the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous many times that I felt I understood it enough to discuss it. When we're talking about the recovery from alcoholism, we find ourselves taking what are really two positions. So, on one hand, we say that it is the pain and despair of the alcoholic becoming so bad that it finally triggers the recovery. And on the other, we say that it is the spiritual insight of the alcoholic that makes recovery possible. Now, these are really two different things. If we look at one or the other very closely, we decide that it is indeed the genesis of recovery. We could say that they occur simultaneously and let it go at that, but I think it's necessary to examine their relationship more in detail. There are good reasons for this examination. We need to understand how moral, spiritual, and physical bankruptcy can lead to the incredible experience we have come to call recovery. One reason is that we are not satisfied to watch a person suffer endlessly while he or she reaches the proper level of degradation to trigger a recovery. The cost is immeasurably high, and very often the alcoholic does not survive long enough to reach that level. The other reason is that only a few fortunate alcoholics are given the grace of an overwhelmingly spiritual awakening. Very few can say that at a particular moment they suddenly were able to surrender and were then consciously on the road to recovery. As a matter of fact, we don't know when or how recovery begins. All we know is that it does. We know that the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous has only one requirement for membership: a desire to stop drinking. I think that this can be a starting point for our understanding. If we use this as a key, we don't have to wait until the alcoholic has sunk to some particular level of degradation before recovery begins. We don't know what that level may be. It Maybe that there are a number of levels at which the alcoholic can begin recovery, if help is only available at that time. In the same manner, we don't have to wait until the alcoholic has an overwhelming spiritual experience before recovery can begin. Most of us, alcoholic and non alcoholic alike, do not have such an experience. Ours must be a condition of spiritual growth, and there's no better time for alcoholics to begin that growth than when they have a desire to stop drinking. I don't know then whether it is the despair or the awakening that triggers recovery, and I don't think the alcoholic knows either, except in rare cases. If the alcoholic has a desire to stop drinking, it's time for us to get busy.